Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Dirks, and on behalf of ACRL and Choice, I would like to welcome you to today's program, which is Navigating Accessibility to Support All Library Users. And our program today is sponsored by ProQuest. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from ACRL and Choice that addresses new ideas, developments, and products of interest to the academic library community. Free to users, these structured 60-minute live presentations provide the opportunity for interactive discussions of important new issues and developments in academic librarianship by librarians, vendors, authors, and other interested stakeholders. Today, Alyssa Cole is our ASL interpreter, so if you would like to pin her video, you can click on her video feed and then click on the push pin button. That should pull up a drop down for you from which you can select her name in order to pin that video. And Chelsea Cole is providing captioning for today's presentation in the chat box. So, please, if you want to take advantage of that feature, open up the chat box by clicking the little arrow on the left-hand side, and you should be able to see a transcription of the presentation. Also, before we get started, I will just point out a few features of the software. You should be able to see the presentation materials in the main presentation screen. You should also see a Q&A panel and a chat panel on the right-hand side. Like I mentioned a moment ago, you can open and close those using the little arrows on the left of the panel labels. Please use the Q&A panel to submit questions to our speakers. We'll have some time in the middle of the presentation to answer some relevant questions and a bit of time at the end likely as well. So please submit your questions throughout, but know that we will get to as many as we have time for, though we likely will not have time for all of the questions. Also note that we are recording today's session and that everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archived version. With that, I think we are ready to get started. So I will turn the presentation over to Roger.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks for all your help getting set up today. We appreciate it. I was going to say good afternoon from Michigan and good morning to those of you who might be on a different coast. My name is Roger Valade, and we really appreciate you coming to our session today. We're going to talk about web accessibility in support of all library users. We're thrilled to be coming to you in general, and we're also thrilled to be coming to you at this particular time in history, as so much work is moving online, and so many of you are probably dialing in like we are from the comfort of your homes. We hope that you're all safe and sound, and obviously we want to talk a little bit about what web accessibility means, particularly in a time when it's so prevalent and all around us. So as in way of introduction, my name is Roger Valade, as I said. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at ProQuest, and today I have with me virtually, and of course, therefore, with proper social distancing, three special guests. Serena Rosenhan is our VP of User Experience and Design. She has spent the last 14 years studying users of library resources and designing products to meet their needs. Her team advocates for all users, including those with different abilities. Thank you for joining us, Serena. I'm also joined by Sarah Brennan, our Video Product Manager. She began her career as a librarian at the University of Wisconsin, and I am wearing a bow tie, a Wisconsin bow tie in her honor today. Thank you, Sarah. She's going to be talking later in the presentation about an exciting initiative that we're doing to bring audio described video to our academic video online product. It's great to see you, Sarah. She's dialing in from New York. And then finally, on the other coast, we are delighted to have an opportunity to speak with Michele Bromley. She's the IT Accessibility Coordinator for the Office of Information Technology at Portland State University. She serves as a digital accessibility resource for the university, providing support, technical direction, and assessment related to the accessibility of new and existing technologies. She's here to share how libraries can be more proactive with every vendor, and I think you'll find her independent voice and expertise very valuable today. Thank you for joining us, Michele. We've segmented the presentation into three parts. I'll help set the stage at the initial component here. Serena and Michele will have a discussion about what the guidelines and standards mean in practice. And then, like Mark said, we'll have a chance to cover your questions. And then Sarah and I will let you know about some of the updates we're making to our products at ProQuest as well. All right, let's get started. So like I briefly started, our goal today is to share information with you about web accessibility, to discuss the many standards, guidelines, acronyms that cover this space, to make sure that we're all on the same page. We want to discuss some of the common challenges that we as a vendor and you as a librarian or university administrator may have. And we want to talk about making sure that our websites and our content is accessible across the complete range of student and patron abilities. As I mentioned earlier, this is no more important today at ProQuest. We've been working at home, I think, for 7 weeks now. And the interaction that we have with our colleagues and our customers is essentially exclusively through these little boxes on screen as we're sharing today. And making sure that folks have access to this content couldn't be more important. So let's go back a little bit in history. I'm sure you know that Tim Berners-Lee is the director of the World Wide Web Consortium, and he more or less invented the World Wide Web all the way back in 1989. And about a decade after that, around 1997, the same consortium launched the Web Accessibility Initiative, or WAI, and the goal was to promote and achieve web functionality for people with different abilities. And while launching the WAI, he said, the power of the web is in its universality. Access by everyone, regardless of disability, is an essential aspect. And when they were promoting this new initiative, he also added that they would ensure the web can be accessed through different combinations of senses of physical capabilities, just as other activities ensure the operation across different hardware and software platforms. So seeing this focus around the universal access and providing access to everyone built into the web so early on in its development, of course, is really encouraging and inspiring, and it provides something for us to build on. Now, fast forward 20 years, and accessibility really is everywhere. I was working on a version of this presentation earlier this year for our global sales conference, and as I was building out the presentation, I dragged that first photo into PowerPoint. And you can see at the bottom there, it says alt text, a group of people posing for a picture. So PowerPoint today is smart enough to be able to evaluate the visual content of a photo, offer you a suggested alternative text hint, and then allows you to edit it so that that universal access can be provided. Same thing with LinkedIn. That middle picture you took at the same event. When I uploaded it to LinkedIn, it says, would you like to make your photo more inclusive? And it gives you an opportunity again to provide alternative text. Alt text for images is one of the core principles of web accessibility because it provides a textual alternative for non-text content. It has a lot of different uses from a search engine, SEO perspective, all the way down to being read by screen readers so that those who use that kind of assistive technology, and we'll talk more about that sort of technology in a couple of slides, can get an idea of what is in the picture itself. And providing this sort of ability for those of us who use these common day technologies to provide this universal access is so important. And then obviously an event like today, we're fortunate to have Eli as our ASL interpreter. We're doing some chatting in the chat to provide a textual alternative for those of you who might not be able to hear me. And all of these components are really becoming much more prevalent. Now, that's all the case in the setup for the web itself, its foundations, and some of the technologies that we use every day as consumers. But obviously, web accessibility in higher education has been a similar focus for just as long. And I remember back in the 1990s, when I was a young developer working on a platform, one of our first internet platforms, we actually used the JAWS screen reader, browser, as a way to make sure that we were reaching all of the users that we could even back then. Now, aside from the technology, there are a number of standards and guidelines that are being developed all over this market. So we know that regulatory and legislative guidelines are providing us best practices that we can rely on and adopt to make sure that we are meeting the needs of our market, meeting the needs of our users, and obviously helping you acquire technology and solutions along with the guidelines that you might be required to follow if you receive federal funding, or if you have other regulations that your school or your university or your consortia or your library has adopted. And across all of these various regulations and guidelines, obviously, there are real users who are at the center of that. And so those are the folks that we're trying to reach: librarians themselves, students, patrons, researchers. All of them have real tasks and real needs, and we need to be able to achieve accessibility requirements and standards for all of their use. Now, keeping track of all of these aspects of universal access, these guidelines, these rules, and these regulations is really, no small feat, and it can be very overwhelming. And so, where to start? So let's start at the beginning. What is web accessibility? And I know that many of you on today's call, I'm sure, are experts in this field, but for those of you who might be a little bit newer to the conversation, the overall aim of web accessibility is to ensure that there are no barriers that prevent interaction with websites. Many of us traditionally associate accessibility with a visual or a hearing impairment, but there is a spectrum of impairments that can be permanent or even temporary. For example, obviously, visual impairments include blindness. You might have low or poor vision, poor eyesight. You may just be colorblind, and so the contrast of colors on a screen is very important to you. From a motor or mobility perspective, maybe you have the inability to use your hands, maybe you have tremors, maybe you have loss of fine motor skills, maybe you broke your arm. It could be a temporary impairment, and we need to be able to accommodate those types of users. Auditory, obviously, we're very familiar with deafness or hearing impairments. You might just be hard of hearing. All of these users need equal access to content into our websites. From a sensory perspective, you may have seizures, you may have an ASD-related sensitivity, and then recently, cognitive and intellectual development is also a really big focus of some of the standards. You might just have a developmental disability, you may have learning difficulties, you may have cognitive disabilities. Across that same spectrum, we also have a lot of technologies available that help us work with to make sure that those users have equal access to our website. So we call these assistive technologies. Many of the standards that are in place are specifically designed for us to accommodate integrating with these technologies. So I mentioned alternative text earlier. Obviously, if you're using a screen reader and you reach that picture of us posing for a picture, that alternative text is what would be read. And so we want to make sure that that is visible and available to all of the two screen readers for those users. There's even things like screen magnification if you just have poor vision. The speech recognition software might translate text to speech for the content of the page. It may help you navigate the page. There are keyboard overlays that can help with things like motor control difficulties. There's access to subtitled content within videos and within presentations like we're doing today. And I know we'll be talking about that with Sarah a little bit later. We happen to have someone like Eli who can be with us, but obviously not every meeting is going to have an ASL interpreter. And at ProQuest, we actually use a technology called Microsoft Teams for all of our inter-team and inter-company video conferences, and it provides live captioning now. So again, these kind of capabilities and tools are becoming more and more available. And we'll also talk about audio described video later today in our Avon platform related to that. Okay, so we have web accessibility, we have assistive technologies. We also have a bunch of acronyms. We actually have so many acronyms at ProQuest that last week we launched a bot so that our own internal employees could ask the bot, what does this acronym mean? And have a quick answer. It's essentially a robotic dictionary, if you will. And I was thinking about that as we were preparing for today's presentation, because there are so many acronyms that are in this space. So starting all the way at the beginning, the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, is obviously the civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all area of public life. It's probably one of the ones that you're the most familiar with. You'll hear about Section 508 very frequently. That's from the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And obviously, many governmental and higher educational institutions, I'm sure you're very familiar with that particular section and regulation. WCAG is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. That's actually, that comes out of the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortia that I mentioned with Tim Berners-Lee earlier. The WCAG versioning is something that's constantly changing. The official version is 2.1 right now. 2.2 just went live with its first public release for comment. So that's going to be another version that we'll see before the year is over. And then A, AA, AAA are the different compliance levels of the WCAG. And only two more, VPAT, I'm sure you're very familiar with, and Serena undoubtedly will talk about this a little bit later. That's the Voluntary Product Accessibility Template, which is what we as a vendor use to disclose how well our specific products support specific areas of 508. And then we roll all of that into a report called the ACR, or the Accessibility Conformance Report. So it's a little bit mystifying when you hear people talk in this area. If you're new to it, and obviously this is all very much secondhand if you have experience, but I just wanted to lay a quick foundation of terms and acronyms to start. All right, now obviously we are all on the same team when it comes to ensuring that the tools and the content that we're providing is accessible universally. And we really just wanted to call out the point that this is not a trivial activity. This is a very complicated space. We all have a lot of common challenges. I used to work in an academic setting before I worked at ProQuest. I know that change was hard in that academic setting. It was a very complex organization. We had a lot of content that was not easily made accessible to some of our students, and we had to work on remediating that content in a reasonable and timely manner. And that was a very challenging space for me. And so when I came to ProQuest with that sensitivity, I was thrilled to see that we are very focused on solving those problems. We'll talk about some of the challenges and how we are overcoming things that are still a challenge today a little bit later on in the presentation. But producing accessible digital resources and services requires a lot of diligence. We use a lot of tools from a developmental perspective. We do all that testing to make sure that different kinds of screen readers can use the websites that we're creating. And we do all the documentation that's required as a part of the VPAT and the ACR to make sure that that's all very clearly communicated to you. And I can only imagine, working with many vendors across many different regions and different spaces, how complicated that is, on top of a layer of evolving standards and technologies that themselves are constantly changing. So, at the end of the day, this is definitely a group effort. We need your help. You need our help to some degree. We certainly need your help. So whether you have an office that's responsible for ensuring that your students and patrons have access to content that we can work with, if you ever have patrons or students who are encountering a specific challenge, we would absolutely love to talk to them. Serena and her team are always looking for user feedback. We use a framework that was developed by the Silicon Valley Product Group to do user discovery and to work with developmental partners. And we're always looking for people who would like to be a part of that. And we'll also talk about our accessibility committee and council internally as well. And at the end of the day, what we're really looking for is to partner with our library and university customers to make sure that we're meeting your needs. And Serena and her team are really a very core part of liaising between our internal development and product teams and you and your patrons. So Without any further introduction, I will turn the conversation over to Serena.
Thanks, Roger. So in this section, I'd like to turn things for a little bit less from the theoretical and more to the so what, the practical. And with me today is Michele Bromley, introduced earlier. As we mentioned, she serves as a digital accessibility resource for the university and provides support for technical direction and assessment related to the accessibility of new and existing information and communication technologies. Michele's here to talk about how libraries can be more proactive. And she's also here as an independent voice. She's not affiliated with ProQuest. She has not evaluated or endorsed any of our products in any way. So to set the stage, I would like to just set a little context. One of the things that I've observed over my career is that accessibility is an ongoing effort, not just in terms of improving our products and making them better, but really of building up our capabilities in our own organizations. And I like to think about it as a journey because really that helps us acknowledge that it's never done. There's always improvement that can be made, but also that we also can change our organizations and develop their capacities to do this. We can't really do it on our own. There's only so much that we individually can affect, and so we need to engage broader with our organizations. And I included this slide here because it shows how an organization might move from having really no accessibility, really no awareness in the organization, limited resources, to an aspirational state of having what we call infused accessibility, where people really understand and are aware and are making the right decisions and are proactive, and it's just part of how you operate on a day-to-day basis. Many organizations begin their accessibility activities, they kind of start in a small way. Maybe they're being a little more reactive than proactive. There's a few accessibility champions, and they will do an initiative here and there, and that's a fine place to start. It's important to start. This can often lead to a little more awareness and understanding that this is a skill set and a resource that we need, and perhaps an organization might create a shared resource for teams to consult. And then as more and more teams really start to embrace and incorporate awareness, they'll need those skills and capabilities embedded within their own teams. There won't be enough capacity in a central team. And you'll start to see more and more skill and resources and awareness. And eventually we get to that state of infused accessibility, something that we just are doing. And the point here really is to recognize that different organizations are in different places, but that organizations can eventually change. And I believe we can each contribute in some way to that change. So with that, I'd like to get some of Michele's thoughts about what we can do. I'm going to start, and I have a few questions for her, and then if the participants would like to ask questions, if you'd please enter those in the chat. That would be great. So the question, first, Michele, thank you for joining us again today. Our first question for you is, what is your advice to librarians who feel overwhelmed by the responsibility to provide accessible resources to patrons? Are there 2 or 3 practical things they can do to start? Where can they start?
Absolutely. 2 things I would say. First, familiarize yourself with the basics. What does accessibility actually mean in a digital space? And 2, know that you're not alone. Utilize your partnerships with comparator colleges and universities. By familiarizing yourself with the basics, I mean that you need to know that digital accessibility is more than, yes, I can highlight this text with my cursor. Digital accessibility means, as Roger described earlier, that all users, regardless of their means of access or adaptive technology, can use the resource. All functions are accessible without a mouse. If there's audio, there's captions. If authoring is available, content can be authored accessibly. This is why that second thing is so important, that you're not alone, because there are so many excellent free resources that provide a basic introduction to accessibility. If I had to choose one place to start, I would actually direct you to the W3's website, w3.org/WAI /fundamentals. Just over the course of the last couple of years, they've redesigned their website to make it much more user-friendly. I would advise checking out their introduction to accessibility, their accessibility principles, or their perspectives videos. They're short, user-friendly. They provide a succinct, effective overview of the things that you and your campus partners need to know. And not being alone applies to procurement protocols too. Ask other colleges and universities what they're doing. Essentially, it boils down to keeping vendors accountable. You can't accept an assertion that a product is accessible at face value. You have to ask for documentation, and sometimes you have to check out the product yourself.
Thank you. I think that's great advice. I have noticed also the improvements and the great information on the WC3.org site. We use it all the time. The next question is, what campus resources and help should the library enlist? I think you mentioned a few of them, but are there particular places that might not be obvious to look?
Well, this is both a great and difficult question because it's widely dependent on what resources are available and within each department. Often contracts offices are already partnering with IT offices to provide checkpoints for technology procurements such that vendors are required to answer certain security questions in order for contracts to proceed. Ideally, this is the checkpoint at which vendors would also be required to answer preliminary accessibility questions. If IT accessibility support is not necessarily centralized or available on your campus yet, such that those questions aren't already being asked, responsibility for keeping vendors accountable really does fall on the procuring party. And I don't say that to scare you, but ultimately the university as a whole is responsible for making sure that people with disabilities have equal access. There may or may not be centralized support, but if there isn't, it's not an impossible task for procuring parties to take on. Basically, you want to ask the right questions. Don't ask whether a product is accessible. Vendors will almost always say yes, as will their VPATs often, which must be taken with a grain of salt if conducted internally rather than contracted through a reputable third party. Do ask for a VPAT, check it out, see if a vendor self-reports any accessibility gaps. If they do, ask them for any documented workarounds for adaptive technology users. Ask them when those gaps will be addressed. If they don't self-report any issues, ask them more targeted questions. Can users perform all functions without a mouse? Has it been tested with screen reading software or other adaptive technology? If it supports audio, does it support captions, transcripts? Is there visual media? Is there alternative text, audio description? If it's an authoring tool, can users create accessible content? And really, if there's any doubt of a product's accessibility, try partnering with your disability services office to see whether or not there may be students with disabilities who are interested in receiving compensation for taking the product for a test run with their adaptive technology.
That's a great idea. Nothing substitutes for actual use and seeing things in action. I had a question here I'm going to fold in right now where one of our, Naomi, asked any advice on expanding accessibility in a campus institution that is only interested in meeting official accommodations and nothing else?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. I think that I actually just gave a webinar last week on how to get accessibility buy-in at your university, how to get high-end stakeholders on board. Because really, a lot of times folks are looking at accommodation as, well, this meets the ADA. But unfortunately, in a lot of situations, accommodation ends up being reactive. Folks aren't actually getting equally effective access as defined by the ADA and the way that it applies in case law over the last 10 to 15 years. So it's not that you want to utilize that legal hammer right away. In fact, I had a whole slide devoted to don't start with the accessibility gavel. But really, it's a matter of putting together a pitch, starting with, the three main rationales for accessibility: that it's good for business, talking about search engine optimization, greater mobile and browser compatibility, increased revenue and enrollment, talking about how it's the right thing to do, which seems like a given, but really talking about the numbers. The fact that 26% of US citizens identify as having a disability. That's at least 1 in 4 people with a disability that are being excluded from universities and colleges whose explicitly stated missions usually include words like diversity or inclusion. And making sure that folks know that it's not enough to get something after the fact, that proactive accessibility means folks are getting equitable access in the moment. So getting people on board, partnering with other folks on campus, not trying to take it on alone because one voice is not going to influence the higher end stakeholders, right? You need to work with others and get them on board and talk about this. And I know this is terrible to say in a university and college setting, to say, do this with a committee, right? We have a surplus of committees, but that's how we get things done in higher education.
And there is the benefit of buy-in, right? Buy-in is a task you can't skip over, really. Thank you. The next question I had was, should we be looking outside the university? You already mentioned the WC3 website, and we did put that URL into the Q&A. And I think there's a couple of other suggestions in there. What do you have to add here?
Well, in terms of accessible technology procurement, no one is necessarily handling it perfectly in that they're catching all procurements, even at low user impact levels. But there are many exemplar institutions around the country who have really functioning and effective workflows for at least high user impact software programs. The great news is that most are willing to share their resources and best practices. I know because I reached out to several schools of similar size to my own when building the resources that comprise our draft workflow, which is currently in beta testing. If you're not sure who these are, reach out because there is an extensive community. The IT Access listserv through EDUCAUSE, the Athen listserv. I'm actually on the executive council for Athen. There's a fantastic listserv where folks engage and they talk about resources and exchange ideas. Ask what others are doing about procurement. Reach out and see what workflows and resources are working for them. Probably my most consistent finding, and something that now constitutes a critical piece in our own beta workflow, is having an equally effective alternate access plan template on file. I don't know if you've heard of this. It's another acronym, I'm sorry, EEAAP. You may need to allow for the possibility that the most accessible software program within a certain category, the only technology that can adequately meet business needs or fundamental learning outcomes, has a couple of accessibility gaps. This doesn't exempt you or release you from your obligation to ensure accessibility for people with disabilities. It just means that you need to be adequately prepared to offer equally effective accessible alternatives such that users can complete the same functions and engage with the tool equitably. And you can't wait until someone encounters a barrier, someone encounters a blocker, because the amount of time that it may take to get somebody an accommodation for a complex software where pieces are not accessible, it won't be equitable. So you want to think beforehand, how can we build an equally effective alternative access plan and have that on file for when these barriers might be encountered? There are plenty of fantastic EEAAP examples online. You could even just Google them, but I do actually recommend engaging and establishing those partnerships with other comparator colleges and universities.
That's great. Thank you so much. Roger, are you seeing any other questions in the Q&A that we should slip in at this point that are related?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of them. One that I want to kind of touch on, since we're sort of in this space, you just mentioned buy-in and committees and getting things done internally. One question that I thought was really interesting was, do you have any advice on expanding accessibility in a campus institution that's only really interested in meeting official accommodations and nothing else outside of that?
Yeah, and I think that question was also asked earlier, and that was the one where I was talking about how important it is to establish buy-in. Advice that I've given folks in the past is similar to what I'm giving now, that one is first knowing what digital accessibility means and being prepared to give that elevator pitch, being prepared to talk to the stakeholders that make the decisions at your university about why it's not only imperative in an ethical sense, imperative in a business sense, but also imperative in a legal sense, because it's not just the ADA we're talking about. We're not talking about just a law that says don't discriminate against people with disabilities. That's very important, but what has come out of the ADA? 10 to 15 years of case law indicating that it's not enough to provide an accommodation after the fact, something that might take 2 to 4 weeks, put a student behind everybody else in their class, not give someone equally effective access. But in fact, what access means is compliance with, currently, litigation has indicated that it's compliance with WCAG 2.0 AA. As we know, we're at 2.1, and that may progress to 2.2, but in the meantime, WCAG 2.0 AA has been the standard. But helping folks to understand what those obligations are and that it's not as terrifying as it is. So building awareness without fear, making sure that you know your stuff before you start having those conversations, that you're aware of all the resources that exist, because this isn't about building things from scratch and reinventing the wheel. Information about what is digital accessibility, how do we achieve it, what are the resources for self-captioning, what are the resources for high quality but relatively inexpensive contract captioning, knowing where all of those are so that you have answers to provide, and making sure, again, that you're not doing it alone, that you're turning potential objectors into co-champions for accessibility before you even approach that conversation with those high-impact stakeholders.
Great, thank you so much.
Perfect.
We do have a couple of other questions, and I want to make sure maybe we can come back to a few of them toward the end. Michele, our last question is, what is your advice for vendors like ProQuest? How can the procurement process be collaborative and mutually beneficial?
Well, I think my first piece of advice would be the same that I gave to librarians in response to your first question, to familiarize yourself with the basics. Knowing what digital accessibility actually means for all users. We had a really good explanation of what digital accessibility is, and explanation of acronyms at the beginning, but I'm sure that a lot of the librarians attending this call have engaged with vendors that don't really understand. They hear the word accessibility and they hear approachability or availability. It's online, so it's accessible. So making sure that you know what accessibility means, and also recognizing that college and university librarians are accountable not only to the ADA and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, but also ethically to their students. They need the documentation they're requesting. It's not personal that they can't take a vendor's word when a vendor says that a product is WCAG 2 compliant. I think the most important thing for vendors is to be clear and straightforward about the scope of the VPAT. Provide details about how accessibility was determined. Provide enough detail that procuring parties can clearly ascertain where users might encounter potential accessibility issues, and easily determine what additional support might need to be provided because of those accessibility gaps. In terms of how it can be mutually beneficial, like I talked about earlier, this is a great rationale to pitch to vendors, but also to high impact stakeholders at universities, that it's good. Accessibility is good for business. Greater compatibility across devices and browsers, dramatic increase in search engine optimization. A recent study commissioned by DQ Systems found that 70% of internet websites in certain industries were inaccessible to the vision impaired, missing a $6.9 billion market. Accessibility isn't just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do.
Thank you. We're going to try to come back to a couple of your questions in the chat in a little bit, but I think you're going to want to not miss some of the things that we have. Thank you so much, Michele. This is really great advice, and I think there's a lot of things that you referenced, and we will do our best to get those into a follow-up to this. I think some of them have been put in the chat, and we will get those resources out as well.
I'm happy to share some links and pass them your way, so you can pass them along to attendees as well.
Yes, we'll do that. The percent of inaccessible, okay. So just to wrap this up, I think the important thing here is to understand just those 2 or 3 practical things that you can do to move your organization forward. It's to understand that you can start where you are. And there can be a lot of different types of activities. You may not be able to influence the dean where you sit, but you can influence your team members and your the patrons that you interact with. So my suggestion here is to maybe you focus on activities that help you connect with others, as Michele talked about. Don't do things alone. Find allies. Build a support network. Obviously, the learning, we talked about that a lot. Understand the terminology so that you feel confident speaking to people about this. Get a little bit more savvy about the technology and those tools and how they interact and where those intersection points are. And these are things, there's a lot of resources available through the WC3. There's good training, and there's a lot of resources out there. Another activity you can try is just start to adopt different best practices. Try one out, pilot it, see how it works. It'll expose people to doing things a different way, and people will become comfortable with it. We've done a lot of these kinds of things at ProQuest internally. I remember years ago where I got some resistance from our development teams who were like, oh, we can't add extra steps. It'll take too much time. We have to do accessibility later. But eventually we've convinced them to really build it into their process as they go. And finally, if nothing else, activities that build empathy are really powerful. Whenever you can observe, whenever you can hear from a user what their experience is, that's important. And then if you get permission and can share that with your team members and those that you are trying to fill. There are also some fun tools out there that are disability simulators that can be good exercises, maybe in a team setting, to experience technology and the web, how people with using assistive technologies or with certain disabilities might experience them. These are just some little ideas about practical, small things that you can do that will move you down on the journey. So we want to switch gears just a little before we run out of time here and talk to you about what we've been doing at ProQuest. So as I mentioned, it's a journey. That's one of my favorite ways to contextualize accessibility conversations. One of the activities that we've been doing this year is really putting some effort into our accessibility conformance reports. And by that, I don't mean that we did not put effort into them before, but making sure they're updated in a timely fashion and that the product teams understand the importance of doing that they have the tools and means to do it, that we're complying with the latest templates, and that you can have confidence and that they're sufficient detail, as Michele mentioned, to help you understand the scope and the means by which they were derived. Another initiative that I'm excited about is we are working on improving accessibility statements for all of our products. And we're really taking a little bit of a different, for us, new approach to these and making them very targeted toward a user of assistive technology, helping them understand before they use this tool what they can expect from it and how well it works. This is also going to address new requirements that are coming out in the UK for accessibility statements, but I think you are going to find them really helpful in terms of understanding and that transparency and communication about our products. And we're working internally, some of those organizational journeys that I talked about earlier, that acknowledgement that one team, one leader, one product team can't do it all. If we're going to really get to that accessibility-infused organization, we need more visibility, we need more input. So the way we're trying to build that at ProQuest is we built an accessibility council, and it's cross-functional. One of the purposes is to really make sure all of our teams have access to the resources that they need and they understand the expectations and the cadences and standards that they should meet. And it's really helping to, a lot of people are enthusiastic about it, but they don't know what steps they should take. And the council is really meant to help guide and channel efforts and maximize what we get out of our ability to deliver. And then finally, we have some ongoing product improvements that we'd like to share with you today. So Roger?
All right, thank you, Serena. Thank you, Michelle, that was amazing. So yeah, one of the things that we wanted to highlight today for us, obviously, is that kind of where are we in all of this, this framework of acronyms, guidance, guidelines, all these different tools. And I'm pretty proud of where we're at from a platform perspective. Our interfaces are very well regarded in general. From an accessibility perspective, we focus on development tools and techniques that we can use to make sure that that's the case. We've done some training with our developers, as Serena mentioned, and I think we've made a lot of progress. For those who may not have had experience in this kind of a space before, they understand sort of where we're at now and how important it is to us as an organization. One of our challenges as ProQuest is, as an example, our ProQuest platform has over 1 billion documents in it. And so ensuring that that content is accessible is not a small challenge. So, you know, we get PDFs, images, older newspapers. We have, you know, some books that are 6 centuries old. Ensuring the accessibility of that sort of content is something, it's a daunting task. And so I just wanted to show you a quick example. As you can tell from my picture, I like to wear bow ties. And so I was on the ProQuest platform and I went to the Vogue archive and I searched for bow ties and I found this charming article called Puppy Love about 2 dogs that have made the very important decision of getting married and doing so rather dapperly. And as you can see, just on that is sort of a bifold, you know, layout. There is actually some white text right above the groom puppy, and that's going to be a challenge for many of our users to see and to interpret that. And so what we've actually done is integrated with a tool. So first of all, we prompt behind the scenes. If we can detect that you're using a screen reader, we will offer that user the opportunity to, on demand, generate a text-only version of this image. And so when they actually invoke that functionality, we call out to a service in real time and actually go ahead and OCR that text. And in this particular case, it worked out actually pretty well. It shows you that, where's the text here? It says, "A little groom gets all dolled up for his walk down the aisle. Hat by Stephen Jones, tie by Brooks Brothers." And so that's actually pretty useful. So if we didn't have an alternative text for this article, the user can generate it in real time and get an idea. It's not perfect, but it might give them an idea. Do I want to go and more officially remediate this? Or am I happy with this? Text was good enough, it was clear enough. Or now that I can see that, I'm actually not interested in this article anymore, and I can move on to other things that might be more what I'm looking for. So this is a feature that's on the ProQuest platform today, and you're love feedback if you've used it or haven't had a chance to use it and use it in the future. Obviously, would love that feedback. Just a very simple example of the sort of complexity that we have with non-text content. And now I'm going to turn the ball over to Sarah, who's going to talk about some of the exact same problems that we're trying to solve when it comes to video.
Thanks, Roger. I'm really excited to be here today to share a case study of a big improvement that we've made in academic video online this spring, which is that we've added audio-described video. And I'm going to explain a little bit about what that is and why it's such a difference maker for students with visual impairments. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the evolution of this project and how we really partnered with libraries to bring this to life. So I'm going to start by explaining what audio-described video is, in case anyone's not familiar. But it's an additional audio track that gets added to a video, and that track makes visual images, including moving images like in a motion picture, accessible for those with visual impairments. And it does that by adding concise, objective descriptions in the form of narration of what's happening on screen. And really high quality audio descriptions pause the video player and they insert the audio description and then they resume playing the video again once the images on the screen have been fully described. And that way the audio description doesn't overlap any of the dialogue and it doesn't feel rushed. And the goal for audio description is so that anyone with a visual impairment can rely completely on the audio description to understand what's happening on screen. So why does this matter? Why did we want to add this to the product? And to explain that, I'm going to go just a tiny bit into the history of accessibility in video, which starts with closed captioning, which was first introduced to broadcast television in the early 1970s. And it became commonplace pretty rapidly by the 1980s. It was present in mainstream television and film, and it provided an accommodation, a reasonable accommodation for those with hearing impairments. And we've had that in educational video as well. Academic Video Online has had searchable scrolling transcripts since we launched the product. And this is what that looks like. You can see on the right-hand pane, the transcript scrolls along as the video progresses, and we have captions in the center as well. And so this is obviously for those with hearing impairments, that they can rely on the transcript or the captions as an alternative to the audio itself. And so similarly, audio described video was introduced shortly after that, in fact, in the early 80s, but it's just had a much slower path to mainstream consumer film and television. And it's been slow as well to educational video resources, and mostly that's due to high cost. But we feel strongly, because librarians feel strongly and accessibility advocates feel strongly, that students with visual impairments deserve the exact same accommodations as those with any other accessibility needs. And this is a tool that needs to become much more mainstream than it is. So it's a given that we wanted to do this. The question was just, how do we implement that? How do we bring it into academic video online in a way that best meets the needs of libraries? And to me, this is the most successful part of the project, because this is where we collaborated with a lot of libraries to ask their opinion and give us lots of guidance and feedback. And it's been really a pleasure to see that be successful. So for the past several years, customers have certainly shared that they'd like to see us add audio description. I would say it was very ad hoc. We heard those requests on and off very sporadically. But over the past 12 months, those requests that we add audio description became much stronger and much louder. And so as product manager, I spent the last few months really digging in, engaging with a lot of libraries who were making those requests to just ask a lot of questions. And they were very gracious with their time. And I was completely inspired by how passionate they were and what excellent advocates they were for their students in sharing what they needed most and what would be the most meaningful way that we could bring this into the product that would solve their problems. So we landed here. We added audio described video to some of our highest use videos. This one I have on the screen is called Quiet Rage. It's one of the most watched videos that we have in academic video online. And this video is really unique because it's about a very seminal psychological experiment that took place in the 1970s called the Stanford Prison Experiment. And it features the original psychologist who conducted the experiment and some of the original participants. And they speak about what that experience was like. But what makes this video so unique is that it uses a lot of original video footage from the experiment itself and a lot of still images, so photographs that appear on screen, and then the participants discuss them. And if you could not see clearly what was happening on screen, you'd be missing just a huge amount of the learning value of the video. You'd pretty much be lost if you were only relying on the dialogue. And so by adding the audio description, we've now made this video accessible for those with visual impairments, and they can get the same learning outcome from this video as the rest of their cohort. So that feels great to be able to introduce that into the product. But what we heard from libraries, what this collaboration showed us, was that that wasn't quite enough. And what librarians shared that they desperately needed was an on-demand service. So it's great that we started with our highest use titles, and those will certainly be used. But librarians expressed to me the most requested thing is the ability to have an on-demand service where any video can be requested and we will add audio description to it at no charge. And what I understood from libraries was that this service is what's missing from educational video providers. And so we couldn't be more pleased to bring that to life, to be able to offer that to our customers at no charge with a 2-week turnaround. And I encourage everyone to try this link that we have here, and we'll circulate it after the presentation, and really experience for yourself the power of audio description. And I encourage everyone kind of to invoke something Serena mentioned in her presentation, which was about empathy, to use that link and really imagine that you yourself might be visually impaired and see the power of audio description in making the video truly accessible. And that's why we're so grateful to all the libraries who were so passionate and so gracious with their time and really helped us understand how to bring this to life. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Roger.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. That was amazing. I love that feature. And so we're pretty much at the wrap-up stage now. We just wanted to share a kind of a quick thought from another voice in this accessibility landscape. Dylan Barrell is the Chief Product Officer at Q Systems, and we actually sometimes consult with them. They have an office pretty much right down the street from us in our Ann Arbor hometown. And Dylan presented at this year's CSUN webinar, and his conference, and his webinar is called Agile Accessibility for Good. And as Serena mentioned, I love her metaphor of a journey. And navigating accessibility is essentially navigating change. We have all of the complexity of the regulations and the responsibility that we have to provide universal access. We have changing reality when it comes to school and library usage, certainly now in these times, and being flexible, acquiring new behaviors, suppressing old bad behaviors, learning new skills clearly is an important part of bringing our resources, content, these services to all of our users universally and equally. And obviously, I'm very proud of the work that we've done on our team to start that, to progress ourselves on that journey. Certainly nowhere near being done yet, but we want to help you. We need your help and support as well. Clearly, we're all in this together, and it's going to be an interesting development as we continue to move forward with some of these capabilities, ensuring that we meet everyone's needs. So I want to quickly thank Michele. Your expertise was invaluable. We very much appreciate your joining us today. Serena, Sarah, thank you for all of your time. We're pretty tight on time. We might be able to do one question, but we do have a lot of questions. So I think what we're going to do is accumulate those into a post-webinar document and try to get those answers out to everyone if that works for you. Serena, Michele, Sarah, if there's a specific question that you see in the chat that you'd like to talk about right now, that would be wonderful. And we will get these links out that as well that Sarah mentioned too. Are there any questions that we should address today?
The one thing I'll answer, Roger, is I did see a question, how do you request audio description for a title? And we will circulate after the presentation, but the short answer is just send us an email. It's as simple as that.
Okay, that is easy. Thank you. All right, great. Well, thank you all for your attendance today. And I think maybe I'll turn it back over to you, Mark.
That sounds good. Thank you so much, Roger. And thank you to each of our presenters today, and to Eli and to Chelsea for providing interpretation and for transcribing the session. We very much appreciate that. I would just remind folks to be on the lookout for a follow-up email tomorrow with a link to the recording of this session from ACRL and Choice. And you should see, hopefully, a link to SurveyMonkey to fill out a brief survey. If you have 5 minutes or less, just to let us know what you thought of the presentation today, we would really appreciate your feedback. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and we will hopefully see you on another webinar soon. Thanks very much.